host. I'm very, very grateful to be joined by Mohammed Shehada, someone I have tremendous respect and admiration for, someone I've learned a great deal from. Before I introduce him in the conversation, we're not going to have a Zoom call next week. So we will take the week off, but then we will be back on the following week on Friday, November 1st, with Professor Seth Ensiska, who's written, I think, a really important essay in Jewish Currents about the history of Israel's invasions of Lebanon and the way in which this current invasion follows from that history. So that'll be on Friday, November 1st, not next week, but the following week. Mohammed Shehada is a writer and analyst born in Gaza. I have been reading him for quite a number of years. The columns that he's written and also his presence on X, formerly Twitter, which I would strongly recommend that you follow him. I think he just consistently conveys a depth of understanding and knowledge, and also just a humanity, a decency that I find rare in this moment. And he really engages in good faith with people who have different points of view, but I think just consistently shows how many of the arguments that are so prevalent in the United States just don't pass basic, just don't make sense intellectually, don't make sense morally. So I'm really grateful. Mohammed, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
There's so many things I want to ask you about, but I wanted to start with a piece that I know you've been working on for a while and that maybe we can put in the chat, that was ultimately published in the New Arab, I think, about the way people in Gaza reflect upon October 7th and the contradictory set of feelings that the people you interviewed, many people, and again, you yourself know Gaza very well. Maybe you can talk about what you learned talking to dozens and dozens of people in Gaza about the way they think about October 7th and its aftermath.
Okay, thanks so much, Peter. And likewise, I have learned a great deal from following your work for many years. I highly respect your integrity and decency and deep intellect on the topic. So basically, I was given an exercise by US newspaper, mainstream media, that asked me to look at how Palestinians view October 7th or the war in general. How is the war impacting their views of Hamas, the PA, the peace process, etc. And I spent many months just asking virtually every Palestinian I come across these basic questions. And the picture that I got is very, very sophisticated beyond the reductionist headline of saying that, for example, most recently in September, 56% of Palestinians support October 7th. The headline is usually conjured up to dehumanize Gaza and say, look, they deserve it because they support Hamas. But once you actually talk to people and look at other questions than how they view these events, you look at the question of what exactly do they support and why do they support that aspect of October 7th or of the war, you get a lot of nuance there. And you get a lot of complexity of people basically quarreling with moral quandaries, conundrums every single minute of the day, and people harboring even contradictory feelings about that event. So one most recent event was basically someone who I know supports Hamas very much, even before October 7th. And I met him in Doha in Qatar. And I asked, okay, how do you feel about that day? He started very proudly saying it put us back on the map. It restored our dignity, etc. And then I retorted, okay, but what about the destruction of Gaza? And he responded saying, well, Gaza was not any better before. It was slow death. Can you mention any good thing about October 6th? And later on in the conversation, we shifted to other topics. But later on, I was sort of in awe of that moment of him just resigning in despair and saying, if I can take all of it back, if I can go back to October 6th, I would do it in an instant.
Hmm.
So harboring these contradictory feelings of both being supportive and against at the same time. But basically, I've seen people from day one, from the start of October 7th, who had moral objections about atrocities that unfolded on that day. I had a friend whom I called and asked, and he's usually very supportive of armed resistance. And I asked, okay, how do you feel about what's happening right after October 7th, as it was unfolding in the media? And he brought up something on his own, unprovoked. He said, I saw that woman, Sherry Babas, the one with the two kids being kidnapped to Gaza, and I was appalled by that. I wanted to be there to protect her. I wanted to comfort her and shield her from that situation. And I heard similar moral objections. There's a senior Palestinian diplomat that's been very, very vocally supportive of, or very vocally critical of Israel's war on Gaza. And he mentions it in a discussion, unprovoked again, out of his own. He says, I think it was a horrible decision to kidnap kids and women back to Gaza. They should have been released immediately. And I hear more Palestinians that say exactly the same thing. Women and children should have not been kidnapped and should have been released immediately. And I got struck by one very close friend whose entire family was exterminated. Not a single surviving member of his family, except I think for one sister. His dad, his mom, his siblings, and their children were killed. And I asked, okay, how do you feel about this? And he basically say, I'm still until now, I'm still against the killing of civilians. It should have not happened. And I think the kidnapping of women and children should have not happened. They should have been released immediately. So there is that layer of moral objections. A lot of people are reluctant to mention it publicly because Israel would immediately take that statement, put it on their Twitter accounts, and say, look, Palestinians agree with us. Hamas is the problem. We have a just cause. We have a just reason to fight and basically wipe out Gaza. There's also another layer of people politically objecting to October 7th, of saying that it was a miscalculation, that it caused a lot of destruction on Gaza, that it gave Israel the pretext to unleash what it's been saying to us in Gaza for a decade. Since the last major war, 2014, we had a lot of Israeli generals and a lot of even defense ministers like Avigdor Lieberman, who kept telling us the next war will be the last one. The next war will finish the Gaza question. It was very open. So there are a lot of people who would object to say that it gave Israel the chance to do what it's been saying for a very long time. And a lot of people pained by the amount of death and destruction in Gaza that it pushes them to say this was a horrible decision. It should have not have happened. At the same time, there is a greater amount of people, including some of those ones who say October 7th should have not have happened, who would retort and say, well, October 6th was not any better. Gaza was locked up in a permanent situation of non-life for its people to languish and die before ever experiencing any measure of decent, normal, basic living. Most of my friends, they reach the age of 35, 36 without ever having had a job or afforded to fall in love or start a family or put food on the table. Every moment of their existence for the last 17 years is just pure shame. Every time you open the door of your room and go to your parents to eat breakfast that you didn't contribute to, you bow your head down. Every time you go out in front of your neighbors, you bow your head down. The most painful day for almost everyone I know in Gaza was basically their birthdays. I was always very afraid to say happy birthday. It meant that your life is languishing, you're getting older, nothing is happening, you're gonna die before you ever got a chance to live. So a lot of people would point to that situation of saying it was unlivable before. And there's a very prevalent sentiment that is documented in polls of saying even people who oppose October 7th, that is on the why question, even people who oppose October 7th, they say that it put the war and this event, it put the Palestinian cause back on the agenda. It brought global attention to it at a time that it was a dying cause, something being deprioritized. And I can attest to that personally because I've seen before people just giving up on on Israel, Gaza, Palestine, and moving on to other topics, saying that it's intellectually dull, it's counterproductive, it's gonna be there this way forever. Whereas now, right now, I'm at a seminar or a workshop with a group of young people from 5 different continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, Northern America, and Latin America. And although the topic of discussion with this group is nothing about Israel, Palestine, you can see it. People who have no connection to the Palestinian topic, they bring it up all the time, unprovoked, out of their own. They keep pointing out, look at Gaza, look at what's happening in Gaza, 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 Gaza. So I can attest to that. I should not go on for too long, but I can explain the why of the question, because bringing back attention to the cause in its own is not a goal. It's not a profound reason. It's a question of why does it matter that people look at the situation again?
Thank you. I want to just encourage people to put questions in the chat, which I will convey. Can you give some? I want to ask about what possible futures there may be in Gaza, but I think it's not right to talk about the future without first talking about the present. Can you give a sense of what life is like in Gaza today? There's been a lot of attention on what's happening in the north, but people in America, you see the odd pictures or you find the news stories, but try to give a sense of how are people actually surviving in Gaza today? What is daily life for people in Gaza and under these unimaginable conditions, and how does it differ depending on people who are in the north or people who are in other parts of the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, absolutely. But one last sentence on October 7th is the question of what people support. And every person I ask, even in the poll, it says the absolute majority, about 90%, they think or their support is primarily focused on Hamas's offensive against military targets, against Israeli military targets. And one of the reasons of the why people support it is, as I said, they say October 6th itself was unlivable and there were no alternatives. This very deep disillusionment with every single alternative that's been tried and crushed, peaceful protest, negotiations, etc. That after October 7th, I got a message from a friend. I was talking to him. He used to work with the Americans as a liaison between the American consulate and the Palestinian Authority. He's very deeply involved in the peace industry, has a huge amount of Israeli connections and friends, both left and right. And I asked him, okay, how do you feel about what happened? And he say it was right. An eye for an eye. They left us no other choice. It humbled Israel. And I get very surprised by that. But it's very deep from his own personal disillusionment with the peaceful path. On the question of how it feels now in Gaza itself, I would say it's very much like the Hunger Games. I've never seen anything like this. I've lived through 3 Israeli wars on Gaza, 10 military operations, and 2 ground invasions. That's how we measure our age there. And I've never seen anything close to this. Nothing by far is close to this. Basically, at some point, I have a close relative who was detained in the Emirates because he was speaking at work to his colleagues about what's happening in Gaza. And they wanted to report him back to Gaza, although there's no borders functioning. And I was made aware of that situation. And it gave me an immediate panic attack about where is he going to be to keep him safe. I tried to think very hard. Where should I tell him to go if they report him to Gaza? Where should he stay to be safe? There's basically nothing. Where should he stay in the first place? There's not an inch that is not overcrowded. How am I going to find him a tent to sleep? There's none. How am I going to find him food? There's basically virtually nothing that is affordable to people there. And I went through this mental exercise that allowed me to basically process the full extent of what's happening, because since October 7th, my coping mechanism has been burning myself out, keeping my mind busy, working 24/7 so that I don't have any mental or emotional range to process what it actually means. But it was a moment of confronting the true extent of it. So basically, in the north of Gaza, that is the most extreme. It is at the moment, you have nonstop bombardment day and night, especially in Jabalia, Beit Lahiya, Beit Hanun, the very north of it. And you have full-fledged starvation. Israel allowing the very, very minimum or even less, way less than the minimum required for people to survive. It's only barely enough to stop mass death because it does not look quite well on camera, but nothing more than that. So I have a friend, Nada, who's a mother of a child that was born right before October 7th. And at some point, she writes me and says, Muhammad, we are out of drinking water. We barely have any salty water. And there's no food, there's no formula. And she was asking basically for practical advice. She says, I want you to tell me, what should I do if my son starves and dies before my eyes? I cannot breastfeed anymore. How do I stay sane? How do I not lose my mind? She was asking for basic practical advice. And that was the situation, I think, back until March. It improved slightly for a few months. And now it's back again. I just got a message from her and I tried to comfort her a few days ago. And she's saying, I'm having suicidal thoughts. How do I resist them? Tell me, is there a way to stay safe? How do I prevent my son, my husband, and myself from getting killed? Where should I go? Just basically asking for very simple, practical questions. And I did not have an answer to any of them. So, in terms of just survival, there is virtually no room. There is constant bombardment, there's no space, there is no infrastructure because the majority of it in the north and the south has been destroyed. And the very few tent areas, the humanitarian areas, the Israeli call it in the Mawasi, near Khan Yunis and Rafah, it's disease infested with piles and piles of garbage and pure sewage running between tents, overcrowded with hundreds of thousands of people. And even then, in the tent city itself, it's constantly bombarded. In terms of if any of them get sick, there's basically no hospital, even if it's a serious condition. So I have friends who, one of my friends said that he's feeling one half of his body is getting increasingly paralyzed. It's very numb, and he cannot get any treatment for that. His mom at some point was wounded and broke her arm, and it healed on its own. So the bones are sort of fixated in a wrong way, and she needs surgery, and she cannot get any. And you can go on and on and on with these sort of unlivable, purely unlivable situation. Added to it is the viciousness of it all, that basically you see things that you've never seen or you've never expected to be humanly possible. To see Israeli tanks day and night running over people, turning them into mush, and Israeli soldiers walking into homes, burning it to the ground after playing with women's lingerie, after playing with kids' clothing, and taking pictures and videos of it. And it keeps signaling to people all of these daily atrocities, nonstop, signals to people, your time is next, you're up next. And there's the third layer to it that is most painful, is to see all of this and then see global silence about it. Not even media coverage, no more condemnations, no government statements, etc. And I keep getting messages in the north and south of saying, did the world move on? Have we been forgotten? Is there any way to bring attention back to what's happening? And I don't have any answers to that.
Mohammed, you are a kind of a bridge in because you're from Gaza and you talk to people from Gaza all the time, and yet you're also living in Europe. You talk to journalists a lot. You talk to government officials a lot in the United States and Europe. So, what is your what how do you explain the fact that what are your interactions like when you're talking to people, policymakers and journalists here about what's happening and about the fact that there is not that people that the media and government in the United States in the West, you know, is complicit, and why can't people respond more?
Mm. Absolutely. It's a very schizophrenic experience in many ways because what people say behind closed doors is the exact opposite of what they're willing to say once you put a camera on them. And it's also a very extreme experience in terms of seeing that just the worst of humanity constantly on display. And it's not pure evil, but it's rather cynicism, cowardice, ignorance, pure self-interest, fear, and careerism, people not wanting to speak up or say something because they don't want to lose a job because they're afraid of character assassination, etc. With the media, there were three main problems. I think Peter wrote about this very profoundly, and I've seen a lot of studies and publications about media bias. It's well documented. But from my own personal experience, it's very maddening because up until October 7th, there were some mainstream media in the US, some cable TV, that would reach out to Palestinians and try to platform us. I was approached once by the Jerusalem bureau chief of an American mainstream media who said that we would like to bring you on and other Palestinian voices regularly to give analysis and insight about what's happening. And that was around the George Floyd incident or killing. So you can see mainstream media and corporate media trying to sort of diversify or lean and accommodate more left-wing voices or Palestinian voices. Comes October 7th, there is immediate deplatforming, radio silence, no more invitations. But at the same time, you get a lot of messages from journalists who are asking for information from you anonymously. And you get very disappointed, very frustrated, and angry that you give a lot of unrequited toil. They ask for a lot of information and they don't publish any of it in many incidents. They don't publish a single word of it. Or in other incidents, it would be either mentioned in passing to justify an article that is whitewashing Israel heavily, or completely distorted and manipulated. And then there is the third layer that has been most maddening to me is that I do an exercise. I don't recommend it anywhere to anyone. It's a very painfully tedious one. I read every single Israeli newspaper day and night, 2 hours in the morning, 2 in the evening, 16 of them. And every day I see headlines, news, and information there that is nowhere to be found in any Western mainstream media, none. And I try and try and try to bring it to their attention, and none of it is being mentioned there. So,
Can
in
you
a
give me an
sense,
example, Mohammed? What kinds of things are you seeing in the Israeli media that is not getting into the Western media?
you can see, for instance, about who's actually sabotaging the ceasefire talks. And in Israeli media, it's unanimous, even in publications that are very right wing, constantly saying, I think the only exception is Channel 14 because very pro Netanyahu. The rest of them constantly say Netanyahu is ruining any chance of a ceasefire. Netanyahu is sabotaging it. Netanyahu is sabotaging it. You open any sort of mainstream media publication or newspapers, most of the time you would get the impression, okay, what is happening is that Hamas is to blame for this. There is also the other example when the 6 hostages were murdered or executed in a tunnel in Rafah recently. You saw Israelis overwhelmingly coming out to blame Netanyahu and say Netanyahu ruined any chance of getting them out. You see also Israeli media Channel 12 recently, they said that Hamas offered to release Jordan Bibas in November, the father of Ariel and Kfir. And Hamas said that the rest of the family were killed in an airstrike, but they were willing to give their bodies. Israel refused, Netanyahu refused to take them. You see also another thing about an elderly Israeli hostage that was told early on in captivity by Hamas that they wanted to release her unconditionally because she was ill. And that was signaled through Qatari mediators. And Netanyahu refused. And Hamas even threatened to put her at the border and leave her there. And I do not mean to mention these incidents to absolve them of any responsibility, but just to see the schizophrenia of all of these details being published regularly in Israel and none of it in the US. It's quite maddening. There's also the dimension of public officials, and that is also incredibly, incredibly shameful. And it goes into three categories. There are some that are very ignorant, that you feel embarrassed on their behalf. I run into them all the time. Some would say that the only reason Israel maintains an occupation is security. That's my belief. That's one person who told me that, and he's working on the Israel-Palestine desk foreign ministry in a central, large European country. And I was like, I know 500,000 Israeli settlers who would disagree with you, and you couldn't convince the guy of that argument. He just wanted to maintain his ignorance. Then there is the other category, the more prevalent one, of meeting, no matter how junior or senior officials I've had the opportunity to meet, all of them behind closed doors sympathize greatly with what is happening in Gaza and are very critical of Israel's actions and position. One of them, even a very, very senior diplomat in Germany, of all places. We were sitting at a roundtable meeting with him in his office, me and other colleagues from Israel, Palestine, and the US. And after I gave my input, he interrupted, cut the rest of them. And he looked me in the eye and said, you know what? When I learned that your family's home was bombed in Gaza, that's when the war became personal to me. And I was very, very surprised by that gesture. It's a very touching thing because I don't represent anything of importance to that guy. I've only met him once where I spoke at a panel and he liked my input. That's our only interaction. So I was very touched and moved by this human gesture. He's been to Israel more times than I think he spent time in his own home. He's part of the German foreign ministry. And he said after that, I agree with everything that people in the room have said. And in the room, people said genocide, apartheid. He said there's very, very little that I would disagree with. I agree with virtually everything. Very critical of Israel, he was. But he says, I cannot say any of that publicly. And then I go and at some point, I meet with a European leader who exactly repeats the same sentiment. He even begins by saying, this is Chatham House rules, right? So none of it is going to be on record, right? And then goes on and on and on about how Israel is systematically wiping out Gaza. And he speaks nonstop, but then none of it is going to be said publicly. What made it even more schizophrenic is that I met him again where we were in a closed room meeting with other people, Palestinians, Israeli Americans, etc. And then he left the room to go to another room with a public event, journalists and people of civil society, to summarize what his meeting with us was about. And he wouldn't say a single thing that he said there. He danced around it as much as possible. He tried to be implicitly critical. So this is the second category. And then the third one that I conclude with briefly is basically people who know what's happening, who sympathize with Gaza, and then go out of their way to make stuff up to vindicate Israel. And I wouldn't shy from naming them publicly. One of them is Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock. She goes to Israel at a point where women in Gaza were having their uteruses removed, amputated, to stop post-birth bleeding. Women in their 20s not being able to have any kids ever again to stop post-birth bleeding because there's no medication and there was not even anesthesia. And she goes to Israel at the same point and then goes and writes on Twitter, volunteers, goes out of her way to write something, I'm paraphrasing here, but she wrote something like, I genuinely believe Israel deeply cares for the civilian population in Gaza. As this is what distinguishes the humanity of Israelis from their barbaric enemies or something like that. And I'm very struck by this raging lunatic going out of her way to justify and vindicate an atrocity, although she leads what she terms as feminist-led foreign policy, if that means anything. And I've seen quite a few of those in the US as well, most prominently.
Mohammed, we have a couple of questions of just people who are in the United States or other countries just asking what you think that Americans should be doing.
In terms of what needs to be done, and it's not my own opinion, I'm very sort of despaired in terms of articulating solutions. But what European leaders themselves say behind closed doors, as long as the weapons keep flowing to Israel, you cannot do anything. As long as you don't stop the weapon supply, nothing's going to change. So that's the first one. It might be a difficult one. But the second one, I think, is very personal and important and intimate to me, is just to keep speaking up. It does not seem very significant. I know people despair all the time, and it feels repetitive. A lot of the people in this discussion right now have been engaged on the topic long before I was born. It feels like it's going to go on the same way forever. But it's very touching to people in Gaza when you are facing death every single minute of the day. You're clinging to any hope, no matter what. At some point, I had a friend who was displaced in Gaza at least 3 or 4 times. He's been now displaced twice more after I called him. And I talked to him before Israel invaded Rafah. And he brought it up in the discussion out of his own, suddenly, spontaneously said, you know what? The world is waking up. Things are changing. I saw that this woman, CIA analyst, changed her Facebook profile and put the Palestinian flag. And I was very struck by this. It's a very insignificant gesture. It does not bear any consequence. But for him, it was some hope desperately to cling to. So I tell myself that if I know that my loved ones in Gaza are going to perish, at least let them perish feeling that the world cares, that people can see what's happening to them and are trying to do something about it. Let them die with some hope, at least. But at the same time, I've seen the impact, the profound impact of speaking up and demonstrations and college campus encampments. Basically, very early on in the war, I had a call with a German diplomat. He said that Israel is being pressured to hold off its invasion of Gaza and delay it because of the demonstrations, the sweeping demonstrations. At the time, it was in Jordan because of the Ahli hospital. And he said, basically, we as Europeans are very afraid and feeling threatened to our own diplomatic missions in these countries. And we're also feeling the growing pressure in our countries. So we are pressing Israel in turn to delay its invasion or not go in with full force because it's creating a risk to us. It does not necessarily advocate for violent retribution or action. Far from that. I totally disbelieve in violence, but I believe in public pressure. And it worked to a huge extent in that instant. And even after that, if you remember early on in the war, Israel was raining on Gaza, these MK-84 bombs, 2,000-pound bombs. And that bomb, it creates a fireball that reaches to the temperature of 8,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It can kill people and injure people in the radius of about 300 meters. It's an insane thing to drop on one of the most densely populated areas in the world. And Israel was dropping it on Gaza like candy up until the point where you had the US creating demonstrators creating enough pressure, college campuses, and then Biden takes a step back and suspends supplying Israel with these. You can also measure it with these small steps here and there, allowing food to go into Gaza. The first month or month and a half, Israel was refusing to allow anything in. There was a lot of talk about begging them, basically, try to let the minimum required, and they were refusing. The global pressure is what enabled these Western governments to in turn pressure Israel to allow things to go in.
Mohammed, can you talk, if you feel comfortable, a little bit about your own family's experience over the last year?
I stopped counting actually how many relatives I've lost. The last count I had was something about, I think, 35, and that was many months ago. After that, I stopped asking who died and who's still alive. Some of my family members made it out of Gaza. I went to see them in Egypt. They were totally transformed. I had a cousin, a very healthy woman. She had fair skin. I saw her on the street in Egypt. I didn't recognize her. She had shrunken. She literally shrunk with a very arched back, and her skin was curled up and very dark. It was impossible to recognize her. She recognized me. I couldn't the other way around. I went to visit my grandmother who made it out of Gaza, and until today, she cannot walk. She lost the ability to walk. Her body was mere skin on bone, and her feet were swollen up in a very frightening way. I got a message from my mom saying, you have to come to Egypt and see her. This might be the last time. Thankfully, she didn't pass away yet, but she is completely incapacitated. Still has a lot of problems with the digestive system. She said basically for a very long time, she was staying in an overcrowded apartment in the Nusrat refugee camp, central Gaza. And she said we would get half a piece of bread with some herbs on it to eat per day. And most of the time she would feel guilty that she got that, and she would give it to the kids because she just wanted to prioritize them. She said, I had my chance to live. And that's one of the most frightening things for me about Gaza is that the Gaza that I know has been wiped out. It's a frightening thing to process. It's no longer there. It's not just the destruction of everything, literally destruction of everything. I keep seeing satellite imagery. I don't recognize my neighborhood anymore. If I go there, it would be virtually impossible to find the place where I lived. It's pure rubble, a howling wilderness. And it's not just the mass killing of people that I know. It's also the people that are still alive have become almost like ghosts. A very deeply intellectual friend who can easily summon the most articulate philosophical quotes from different philosophers and intellectuals. When I speak to him, he cannot put two words together anymore. His own brother was wounded, another brother was wounded, he was wounded himself, he kept being displaced. Every time I talk to him, basically his family is living in a tent, he's living on the street because there's not enough space in the tent. And whenever I talk to him, he cannot put two words together. He says, Alhamdulillah, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine, inshallah. And you cannot get any deep conversation with him anymore. That very hilarious friend that I would call when I'm feeling down and depressed, basically lost any sense of life, not just humor. And this feeling that everyone I care about there is now basically gone. And I'm not sure if they will ever come back and recover from this. It's frightening. It's eating me alive. I've read a lot of literature about Holocaust survivors and what it did to them after. And I think one very powerful point made recently by Ta-Nehisi Coates, he said something that resonated. I don't mean to compare Gaza to the Holocaust, of course, but being in a situation where you're surrounded with death with no way of escape, and it's coming to you, and you know that it's your turn in these situations. He said it can turn you empathetic, it can make you very empathetic, but it can also turn you very cynical and very disillusioned, not just with politics or different causes, but with humanity itself. It can turn you into a very dark person. And I've heard it from the children of Holocaust survivors. Some of them would say that my parents became very pacifist or very pragmatic or very empathetic because of their experiences. And some would very honestly say that when my parents survived the Holocaust in the concentration camps, that's when they learned that there is no God, there's no humanity, there are no principles. This world is cruel, it's turning its back on you, everything is up for grab, only the strong survives. And it's a very frightening thing to see what kind of people it would transform Gazans into.
Is it even possible to think about where Gaza will be in the future in the midst of this? I mean, it seems, is it conceivable that Gaza will be a place that's livable for Palestinians? As you say, it was considered unlivable by the United Nations on October 6th, before this. Is it even possible to imagine a future in which Gaza is habitable?
It's very difficult to answer the question, but at least I need to maintain some hope that it could be, if given a chance. As long as the blockade remains, there's no way. As long as the occupation remains, not a chance. But if Gaza is opened up to the world and reconnected, you can, in a way, heal it, not necessarily quickly, but you can begin a process of healing, of moving people away from trauma and making them feel that they're out of danger. I've heard from a lot of Palestinian friends from Gaza who live in the diaspora that as soon as the war ends, they want to go back and contribute to reconstructing it. They feel this urgent sense of responsibility. I think there's also this great survivor's guilt that they want to soothe it somehow by going back and helping their people out. There's a huge amount of energy. You've seen in Gaza itself, with everything that's happening, you've seen people trying and devising a lot of creative ways to survive. To Israel shut down the electricity, for example, as soon as the war started, shut down Gaza's electricity and then fuel October 9th in order to drown Gaza in a full blackout. and you still see people going to great pains to just charge their phones and film what's happening to them in the hope that it can awaken the very long sleeping conscience of the world. And this sort of persistence to survive, to live, and to show what's happening. There are people who would devise tools to bring electricity out of bikes, just cycling and then charging a battery out of it, and just to charge a phone in the hope, okay, maybe this picture I take might make a difference. So that spirit of persistence and survival, I think it can be very powerful to enable people to build Gaza again. There is also, I hear a lot of talks about how many years it would take to only remove the rubble in Gaza. There was the estimate, I think, about 14 years. It's drowned in rubble, quite literally, piles and piles of it. And underneath it, you have at least 10,000 people under the rubble itself. The full extent of the atrocity has not been discovered yet. But I think Gazans themselves, if given the chance, they can be the ones to clear that rubble in record time and start the building in record time as well. You can see people already doing it with just the most primitive tools that they have. But one very strong element would be to open up Gaza to the world and to flood it, literally flood it with people from the outside to show to Gazans that they're not on their own, to just basically restore their connection to humanity, to show them that people actually care. Usually in previous wars, Israel does not allow any foreigners into Gaza except for a few journalists and humanitarian workers. But after each war, there was always this very annoying routine of politicians and UN senior officials coming to Gaza in these very giant vehicles, armored vehicles, with fully blacked windows everywhere, and just going out on a routine tour to take a few pictures with the rubble and leave again. And people pick up on that routine very easily and see the very cynicism of it. But in 2012 in particular, that's a moment where Gaza was half opened up to the world after the Arab Spring, and that was very short-lived for a year. You had a lot of activists coming to Gaza just to show people that we care, we are there for you. And it made a huge difference. This just simply opening up Gaza to the world. A lot of people in Gaza are virtually everyone I know is claustrophobic, suffering from claustrophobia. If the Rafah border crossing before the war, if it was closed, you would see people cannot breathe. You would see people on edge. If it's open, even if people don't want to travel and leave, just having the borders open on the Israeli side, on the Egyptian side, it gives people this breathing room. Okay, there's a way out. I'm in control. I'm in charge of my fate. Maybe I can leave if I need to. But I think it needs to be opened both ways, not just for Gazans to flee and never come back.
Mohammed, do you have a theory about what you think Israel's goal in Gaza is? Do you think Israel has an end game strategy for what this Israeli government, for what it wants ultimately in Gaza?
Well, there were a few elements to the Israeli war on Gaza. One of them is basically the one I mentioned earlier, that this war should be the last one. They should settle the Gaza question, no more mowing the lawn. Just this time, they want to sort of pull the grass by its roots. After each war that Israel launched on Gaza, people were leaving in tens of thousands. So up until October 7th, there was about 250,000 Palestinians from Gaza that had left between when the blockade started up until October 7th. About 250,000 was the estimate. But it was very slow this time. As soon as the war started, you can see the declared goal of Netanyahu telling Gazans, leave, leave while you have the time, leave, don't look back, just keep going. And the assessment of, for instance, European leaders, at least the ones I met with, is Israel is trying to lay the ground to render Gaza completely uninhabitable and incapable of sustaining organized human life. No more schools, no more hospitals, no more homes. The judiciary is gone, police stations are gone, government facilities are gone, factories, shops, small businesses, all of it obliterated so that people would have to leave. I think there was another element about destroying Hamas. And early on in the war, you saw some optimism that it can be achieved on the Israeli side. I remember even some Israelis that are on the left or center left who were saying, yes, it can be achieved. It's going to be painful, but it can be achieved. But quickly after, a few months later, I think by March, I heard it from the exact same people saying, no, it's not going to happen. Hamas is going to stay there. It's not going to be eliminated or destroyed. And you see later on IDF officials admitting this goal is unattainable. So that's the second one. There is also, if you listen to what Israelis are saying now, their idea of the future of Gaza is divided between, I think, two very main visions. One is indefinite military occupation of Gaza. The IDF maintains what they call freedom of operation, which is Gazans' worst nightmare. And one of the most profound reasons why Gazans support Hamas, or the ones who do, one of the reasons they cite is Hamas's ability to prevent Israel from going into Gaza, in and out like they do in the West Bank in the middle of the night, put checkpoints, terrorize peoples in their homes. So that's the first version you get from Israel. Okay, we're going to reoccupy Gaza militarily, but not be in charge of its civilian affairs. Not, we don't want to pay for running Gaza. And then you have the other version, the Netanyahu one, a full-fledged what he calls temporary military government. Temporary means in Israeli language indefinite. That's the Oslo experience. You have the more fringe Israeli far right people that have a lot of influence nowadays who want settlements in Gaza to go in and settle Gaza again. But what it looks like in the near future, Israel is re-establishing its four-finger policy, cutting Gaza into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So now the IDF is cutting Jabalia, Beit Lahi, and Beit Hanun from Gaza City. Gaza City has already been cut from Khan Yunis and Rafah. Khan Yunis is now cut from Rafah. So establishing this four-finger policy, and then the IDF keeps going in and out, in and out, in and out, until in this very long war of attrition, until they bring the place completely down.
And do you think that the Israelis are still hoping, or that Egypt will open the border so that large numbers of people will then just leave Gaza and not be allowed to return?
Yes, very much so. And up until very recently, I heard it personally, this very deep belief that it can happen, it can be accomplished to pressure Egypt enough to open up and take Gazans in. And when they bring it up, Israelis who believe in this kind of policy, they would always say, it's going to be temporary. It's only a temporary measure. To which I always respond, okay, if it's temporary, why don't you take them to the Negev desert and let them stay there and then bring them back to Gaza when you're done? And they don't have an answer to that. So it's still there, very much there. They hope that it can work, but Egypt was very quick to block the borders because they understood. Traditionally, the Egyptians have always maintained that Israel wants to throw Gaza on them while blockading and occupying Gaza. So have Egypt pay for everything in Gaza without having any actual responsibility of running the place. And it's an absolute red line for them.
What, as you know, one of the most frequently cited talking points in the United States and in Israel too, when is the idea of Hamas using Palestinians in Gaza as human shields, embedding in hospitals or schools or whatever, and therefore the argument is often it's Hamas's responsibility when Palestinian civilians die. I'm curious how you respond when you hear that argument.
I think it's the single most offensive argument to make to a Palestinian, to say that you are to be blamed for your own death and Israel is absolved of any responsibility. As I said before, I lived through 3 Israeli wars, 10 military operations, 2 grand invasions. I have never myself seen or heard of any situation in which Hamas or any other militants would actively direct the movement of civilians or force civilians to stay in an area in order to use their presence to, as the definition goes under international law, to render immune Hamas from being attacked. It even logically, from a domestic political standpoint, Hamas, if they were to take someone as a human shield, it means destroying their legitimacy with the Gazan public, destroying their popularity, tanking it completely, to take your own neighbor or your own family member and put them at harm's way and hiding behind them. I My own view is not my own alone. You can see Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others like Jeremy Bowen, the Independent, who in previous wars investigated in depth and said there is no evidence of Hamas taking human shields by the actual definition of international law. Amnesty says Hamas did conceal weapons, for instance, in schools or in other civilian areas or near these areas, to be more accurate. And they said that this of its own can be is prohibited under international law because it means that they're not taking sufficient precaution to avoid or prevent harm to civilians. But they said it does not amount to human shielding. If I tried to study it even more in depth, and I was very struck because you can see it in a lot of other conflicts where Western governments sort of drop restraint, military restraint, and they go full-fledged assault on civilians, and they keep saying human shields, human shields, human shields. One of them was actually Benito Mussolini when he was bombing Ethiopia. He was bombing Ethiopian civilians and hospitals and civilian infrastructure, and he kept saying, okay, the Ethiopian resistance is embedding itself with the civilian population. They're hiding in these places. We cannot get them. They're responsible for these deaths. And you can see it also in Vietnam. You're more knowledgeable in this than me.
Yes.
Israel was, and I'm very grateful that you wrote it in your book that's coming soon. You dedicated a very sort of deep uh, examination of that talking point. But you see it in Vietnam as well. Israel or the US, sorry, dropping millions of leaflets saying, the Viet Cong is taking you as human shields. Or you can see it in the American Revolution itself, these hit and run attacks. You go and hit the British, and then you run back again and hide in the town, or basically camouflaging and disguising American rebel ships as merchant and commercial civilian ships, and then going and attacking the British and going back again. So you see it a lot of times being used by even Western resistance itself when they are fighting for their own independence. In the context of Gaza itself, it's basically Israel has been using these human shields for every time the human casualty was extreme, while at the same time very openly taking Palestinians as human shields. So you see countless reports about the IDF going into neighborhoods, capturing civilians, elderly, young, and dressing them as soldiers, forcing them handcuffed to go into likely booby-trapped facilities and tunnels and homes and inspect different objects. It goes as early as 2008 in my neighborhood, actually, where the IDF, they captured a child and forced him to open bags that were likely booby-trapped. And that's what makes it even more maddening, that you see this mountain of evidence of Israel doing it systematically, but you see only Gaza brought up about them sort of mindlessly to justify anything Israel does. And the last thing I would say about it, I was at one point at a round table where there was an American general that used to be, I think, director of operations in NATO. He's a former general. And he brought up the human shields, and I said, this is garbage. And I challenged him on it in the round table. And after that, he came to me and said, well, you know what? Human shields is a political term. It's not an actually legal term. We don't go by the actual international law's definition on it. We go by the political interpretation. So it basically means it's a matter of convenience. It's sloganeering.
Yes. One last, or maybe just two quick questions. Is it still? I've heard. I've listening to some Palestinians in diaspora, other places. I've heard some people say a version of, it is much harder for me to imagine living side by side along Israeli Jews now than it was before. That even people who had publicly supported the idea of equality under the law, in one territory, with everybody living together, have said. I've heard people say that they find that harder to imagine that now. I'm curious for you, is it still possible to imagine a future of equality and Israeli Jews and Palestinians living side by side, given the horror and trauma that you're describing in Gaza? Or is it is the idea of separation a bit more plausible given the event, magnitude of what's happened over the last year?
I would say in terms of coexisting together, you can see other similarly or even worse conflicts where people afterwards live together. Um, uh, Being Gazan myself, I think this is the worst I've ever seen. You see UN officials saying the same. But if you look, for instance, at the Rwandan genocide and people living side by side after, if you look at Malaysia with the ethnic, sort of latent ethnic hostility between the Malay and the Indians and then the Chinese, the three ethnicities that form the population there, there's this latent hostility. It's underneath, but they manage to live together at the end of the day. It's the same in Bosnia. And in Bosnia, I have even something more extreme where you have every school and sometimes the same school teaching three different versions of history. And each book of history is blaming the schoolmate that is sitting right across from you and saying it's his ethnicity's fault for everything that unfolded. So it can happen. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, as you said, the wound runs very deep. There's this very profound trauma that makes people unable to conceive a future where they can live together. But at the same time, you have, for instance, Palestinians who used to work in Israel. A lot of them might carry some profound ability to conceive a society where they can coexist side by side. And a lot of them, that's one of the things, the reason why you never saw a single terrorist attack or a single violent attack unleashed by a Palestinian worker in Israel. Israel, after October 7th, they tried to say the Gazan workers that were coming in, they were helping Hamas. They were the ones that gave them information. And then the Israeli Shin Bet came out and said, no, there is no evidence of that. We have not found any indication that this is the case. So when Gazans are given a human face, there is the willingness to cover their wounds and then sort of move on. Even when the Oslo Accords were signed, I think Hanan Ashrawi was one of the people that talked about it, of saying Gazans walk to Israeli soldiers with flowers. They perceived, okay, maybe now there's a chance that it can be over. But at the same time, after everything that unfolded in Gaza, the idea basically is that there's almost 500,000 Israelis that took an active part in this genocide. And virtually every single one of them either committed war crimes or saw war crimes or and is an inch away from someone who committed war crimes. That's a very frightening thought, not even from a Palestinian perspective. If I want to put myself into Israelis' shoes, basically to live in a society where the teacher of your kids at a daycare or kindergarten might have murdered a whole family, crushed people under tanks, burned people in tents alive. It's a very, very frightening thought as a society. But there is a process that can be there for sort of truth and reconciliation committees. But I think practically speaking, not just speaking in absolutes and theory, I think Jewish Americans who have been very vocal against what's happening in Gaza can be a very profound bridge, a very crucial bridge between both. They have the credibility with Palestinians that they did not stay silent, and they have the connection and history with Israeli Jews. They can act as a bridge of trying to show that this can be something to achieve, to try to talk to both peoples. I've seen it in recent times. One of the most effective tools to combat anti-Semitism was the If Not Now group, and the group that stood at train stations and held hands and said, not in my name. I've seen people, not just Palestinians, I've seen people across the Middle East who were posting these pictures and saying, wake up, there's a difference between a person being Jewish and a person being a Zionist and a person being an Israeli and a person supporting what's happening in Gaza. So
Yes.
it requires this bridge.
Yes. Um, Mohammed, thank you. We're going to try to release this video more widely than we usually would. And I think we should all ask ourselves, how different things might be in American public discussion if Mohammed and people like Mohammed were on American television and in America's newspapers on a regular basis. I'm so grateful to you, Mohammed, for doing this. Thank you so much, and you're an inspiration to me and to many of us. And I hope one day you and I will be able to have a conversation under better circumstances.
Thank you as well. I'm also very grateful for your work and happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to everyone. And we'll see you not next week, but the week afterwards.